look over there. Is it a bird? Is it a plane? No, it's just me sitting on the top of my bed again because I have nowhere else to film. Hey, it's Emma, and today I am going to talk about something I have been working on for a little bit, so I'm excited to share it with you. I read the entire shortlist for the Women's Prize, and I am going to talk about each of the 6 books, and I'm going to rank them in order of how much I liked them, and then talk a little bit about which one I think is going to win. So if you weren't aware, the Women's Prize is a literature prize given out in the UK. It started in the 90s when a group of journalists and booksellers got together because they wanted to change the fact that so many literary awards were chiefly given to, and the long list was chiefly composed of men. I think in like 1995 when they started doing this, the Booker Prize long list had been like historically 10% women, which is kind of ridiculous, especially in 1995. So that's why they started the Women's Prize to nominate fiction specifically written by women. And I think that any novel originally written in English is eligible on this year's shortlist. There is a novel from Barbados, a few novels from the US, and also a few novels from the UK. I have never really done this before. I have never read the entire shortlist for a prize nomination of any kind. I actually didn't know very much about the Women's Prize until this year, but I looked at the shortlist, I saw it online somewhere, and I noticed that almost all of the books on it were either books I'd already read, and I loved, or they were books that I was interested in reading anyway, so I decided to give it a shot. So here we go. I'm going to talk about each book in order of where I would rank it, and I'm going to talk a little bit about why I personally feel the way that I do. I know that I'm probably going to disappoint some people. There are a couple of books that are very well loved that I've ranked pretty low, so sorry about that in advance. And then I'm going to talk about which one I think might win. However, before I start the ranking, I'm going to have to say that there is one book on this list that I didn't finish, and that is How the One-Armed Sister Sweeps Her House by Cherie Jones. A little bit about the book first. This book is set in Barbados. Cherie Jones is from Barbados as well. It's set in the 70s and 80s, I think, and it follows 3 generations of a family and discusses a lot of really difficult and brutal events in their lives, such as incest, rape, assault, death of children, etc. There's also another character named Mira, who is the wife of somebody from the UK and is living in Barbados right now, and her husband turns up dead. So it's partly the story of this family and sort of the patterns and cycles that repeat themselves over time. And also, to an extent, the story of these 2 deaths, the death of the child of one family and then the husband of another, and how those things become twined together. Now, the reason I didn't finish this book is partially, I think, because I gave myself 1 DNF for this. I said I have to finish all of them, but if there's one that I'm really struggling with, then I decided to give myself a little grace and allow myself to put that one down. And I made it about halfway through this book, and it's not that I don't think it's well written, and it's not that I don't think it's a worthy book. It's just that it was hard for me to get into for multiple reasons. One of them was just like the intensity of the brutal realities of these people's lives. I'm not normally someone who's super bothered by a lot of dark stuff and violence in a book. That doesn't tend to be what I reach for. I think that to an extent, during the pandemic, just because the world is so difficult and awful right now in so many different ways, a lot of the time, fiction has been a lot harder for me to handle than it used to be, simply because of my own state of mind. I also had a hard time following the thread of the story. I felt that although Cherie Jones writes very well, and I thought that she did a good job of sort of describing the motivations behind what a lot of these characters were doing, I felt almost as if they were people I was reading about in a newspaper rather than someone whose head I could see into and fully understand. And so I was struggling a little bit to have that connection that I'm used to in a book. When bad things happened in the book, I was of course upset because those things shouldn't be happening to anyone, but I was upset in the way that I would feel if I saw something like that happen on the news instead of, for example, if it happened to someone that I personally knew. And so that was sort of the difference in this book that made me struggle a little bit to stay invested in it. Just because I didn't finish this book doesn't mean I think that it's the worst one on the list. I'm simply saying that I can't judge simply because I didn't finish it. I only read 50% of the book. If I'd been able to read the other 50% if I had kept going, I think it's very possible that I would have liked this book better than the number 5 choice on my list, or maybe even the number 4 choice. But for whatever reason, I just wasn't able to do that. And so DNF doesn't mean horrible book. It doesn't mean I want to throw it in the trash. It just means disqualified. I just wanted to clear that up before I went on to the ranking. I wanted to explain what DNF did not finish means for me specifically before I got into the books that I did finish. So let's just say that the ranking starts here with number 5. And number 5 for me is Unsettled Ground by Claire Fuller. Unsettled Ground, as from what I've seen from different other booktubers and other reviewers, is kind of divisive. A lot of people absolutely love it. A lot of people don't like it as much. And unfortunately, I think I fell in the camp of don't like it as much. I really wanted to like this, and there are a lot of good things about it. I think it's very well written. I think that Claire Fuller is clearly a good and experienced writer. She started out as a sculptor, which I think is very interesting. The first chapter of the book is honestly one of the best I've read in a long time, because this isn't really a spoiler because this is the whole premise of the book. The book is about these 50-ish-year-old twin siblings, Jeannie and Julius, who live with their mother, who was fairly young when they were born, so she's maybe about 70. Neither of them have ever married, and their father died when the twins were very young. Their mother's never remarried. She's just lived with them in the same old house. They're not super rich, but they get by. And at the end of the first chapter, Dot passes away. And I think that the book does a brilliant job of depicting what it must be like for somebody who, is going through a stroke. And you feel the tension and you feel empathy for her loved ones who may find her the next morning and who do. So after that, I was like, oh my gosh, this is going to be a really good book. And then it just wasn't. I think that the two main characters, Jeannie and Julius, are very well drawn. They're distinct from each other, but they also have this connection that's undeniable. You can see the love that they have for each other and the respect, even when they don't always agree or remember events the same way and they fight about things. I think it's a very well depicted sibling relationship. They also have very different outlooks on life and they want different things. Although they say that they've always been content with staying at home with their mother, Jeannie has a heart condition that doesn't enable her to go outside much, and she has always been a little bit shy. She also struggles with reading because she missed a lot of school, and so she feels very isolated from the world. Whereas Julius, although he loves his sister and his mother, has always felt like he could have maybe had more of his own life by himself, but he always sort of felt an obligation to them, and so he's sort of torn when his mother dies about what he wants to do. However, you can't just have two characters that are good and expect that to carry a book, and in this case it simply didn't for me. The plot line of the book is such that in order for it to be believed, you must also believe that no one talked to anyone else about any of these events, and also that when they did, they all lied. The plot is pretty slow anyway. I was struggling to keep up with it even in the early stages of the book, but as it went on, I was like, come on, this cannot just be another communication error, right? And then it always was. Also, a lot of people's motivation, a lot of people's actions also seemed very outsized compared to their motivations. It's like, okay, I understand you're upset about this thing, but you're really going to wreak havoc this dramatically for this thing that doesn't seem like it would inspire that much hatred? I don't like reading about people who lie for stupid reasons and expect you to feel sorry for them, so as a result, I was not a huge fan of this book. You enjoy family dramas, portraits of English small-town life, or close character studies, I think that you might actually enjoy this book. I personally would give it 2 stars. It wasn't the worst thing I've ever read. I have a lot of good to say about it, but it's just so overshadowed by frustration that I just can't give it anything higher. Next up is number 4, and this is the one I think that is going to make people mad because I know that this book is really loved, and that is Transcendent Kingdom by Yaa Gyasi. This is the story of a 28-year-old woman named Gifty, who is the daughter of Ghanaian immigrants. She's currently a PhD student at Stanford studying neuroscience, and her studies on addiction are fueled by a desire to understand the life of her older brother who died of a drug overdose when he was only a teenager. And also the reaction of her mother, who was so deeply depressed by this, but absolutely refused to acknowledge that she was suffering depression, that Gifty was forced to grow up from a young age, and she felt like she never had that relationship with her mother that she feels like she earned as a daughter because of this major life event that came between them. Woven through all this is also Gifty's relationship with the Christian faith that she was raised in. Her mother is deeply devout. So she was raised in church, and so she's left the church in the sense that she doesn't really go anymore, but she's still drawn to the idea of faith, and she continues to write about what it means to her, about the different things that she took from it, and things that she misses about it and that she sometimes wonders about. So she's kind of caught in the middle between, I guess, atheism and faith. And that reminded me a lot of a book I read earlier this year, which was called Three Daughters of Eve by Elif Shafak. And I talked about that, and I think my May book wrap-up. I'm not really sure, the months all blend together now. I highlighted a lot of what Gifty had to say about Christianity because a lot of what she said resonated with me since I grew up in Christianity and I'm still a Christian. And I really appreciate stories that feature faith struggles like that don't just automatically dismiss faith. I also really grew to care about Gifty and her family, and I was interested in their relationships with each other and the world. However, the way that this book read made it difficult for me to get truly 100% invested in it. It read in a lot of ways like a memoir rather than a novel. I didn't feel like I was there experiencing these moments in Gifty's life. I felt like I was listening to her tell me about them, which is a very different experience. It was like her writing in her diary what happened, and I was a little bit frustrated by that because I really wanted to be there with her. I am starting to believe that this may have been a stylistic choice on the part of the author, and if so, then that is fine. However, I just don't really like it. I wanted a little bit more. I wanted a deeper connection than I felt like I was getting. It just felt really all tell, no show. And then when the resolution came, I was like, okay, I guess that happened. I really wasn't. It just felt like yet another thing that someone was telling me rather than something I was experiencing alongside the characters. I can see why so many like this book, and I did enjoy it. I would give it 3 stars, and that for me doesn't mean it's bad. That means it's totally fine. It was a totally acceptable reading experience. It just wasn't above and beyond, really, for me personally. Okay, now we get into number 3, which is No One Is Talking About This by by Patricia Lockwood. This book was a complete hot mess, but like, I liked it. I don't know. I've never read anything like this before, and I think pretty much anyone who's read it has said, I've never read anything like this before. This is almost 2 different books, and it takes a while for like the second book to show up, but the initial premise is a young woman who seems to be like maybe kind of a stand-in for Patricia Lockwood, she's never named, who becomes Twitter famous for tweeting, "Can a dog be twins?" And she, like, it blows up. It's kind of like a meme. It just like blows up. Everybody wants to know who wrote this. Everybody always references it in daily conversation. She gets invited to all these world events. It's really kooky and weird, but at the same time, very relatable. And it was really interesting to read about the internet by someone who was analyzing it in an almost like sterile clinical way, but at the same time was completely immersed in it. On a couple of different occasions, the woman mentions a kind of panic at not being allowed to access her phone, and she says, "Oh, my information, oh, my answers. What will ever happen to all of these things that I could know, but I just can't because I don't have my phone to look them up?" And that panic is something that I have felt, and it's a little terrifying to admit that dependence on technology, but I think it's something a lot of us feel now. Later in the story, it switches and becomes more emotionally and family focused and deals with a situation within the life of the woman and her sister. And so as a result, that shift was a little bit jarring at first, but I felt that they bled into each other very nicely. And I loved the contrast between we live in a world in which the internet allows us access to so many different things and the average person can get a hold of whatever information they want. But at the same time, we still live in a world where many women have so few choices. A lot of the second half of the story, without giving too much away, touches on women's reproductive rights. And that commentary, like the internet commentary in many cases, is very sharp and witty and wild, but at the same time, this book was a little bit incoherent. Sometimes it repeats ideas a little bit too much for my taste, but overall, I really loved it. I love the surrealist bent that emphasizes the oddity of our world, while at the same time being very clear that it is our world that we are in. This is not an alternate universe. This is right here, right now. And even when it's not fun, it somehow is. So I really liked it. 4 stars. Also, I listened to the audiobook version of this. It was narrated by Kristen Sia, and I thought she did an excellent job. She struck the perfect balance between like totally surreally weird and very moving, and that was appropriate, I think, for this book. Now we're getting into the big leagues. Number 2, Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. So I've talked about the absolutely wild and crazy life story of Susanna Clarke before, but long story short, she wasn't really a writer until maybe her 30s. The idea for Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell came to her in a dream, I think, and then she started writing it, and it became this huge bestseller. It's this like 1,000-page book about wizards in Regency England, and although it is a little bit of a slog to get through sometimes, it's so meticulously written and crafted, and it has these fun footnotes with full of like magical details about the world, and it's just so delightful. And then after publishing a book of short stories set in the same world, she got very sick, and then actually didn't write again for like 10 years. But she comes out with Piranesi, and if anything, it seems to be an even bigger success. So I was really excited to read this book, but a little nervous because I was like, oh my gosh, what if I don't like it? What if I don't think it's as great as everyone else does? I was just, all nerves. But fortunately, I did really like it. Piranesi is a man who lives in the house. And the house is, as far as Piranesi knows, just like this enormous structure, like huger than any mansion you could ever conceive of, bigger than any castle. It seems to stretch on forever and ever. And it seems that there have been other people that have lived here before Piranesi, but he's only ever found bones. It's also filled with very detailed statues of men and beasts, which Piranesi recognizes and has context for, even though he doesn't remember anything outside of the house. By the way, this comes up later. Piranesi loves the house. He loves being there. It's not always easy. He has to learn to like fish. He has to learn to take care of himself all by himself and be self-sufficient. But he counts himself lucky just to be in this beautiful place and to serve the house. He thinks of himself as the servant of the house. However, there is one other human who comes to visit Piranesi every few weeks, and that person he only refers to as the other. And Piranesi at first trusts the other, but he starts to learn that the other is kind of up to no good, and then he starts to learn more about his past and the house's past. This book it was honestly a struggle at the beginning. For almost half of it, I was thinking I was going to rate it like maybe 3 stars or less. But at some point in the book, it all kind of clicked for me, and I felt like that front half was kind of worth it to me because at the end, I was like, oh, this is what she's doing. I'm starting to see her point now. This book takes on so many weighty topics, philosophy and theology, and even a little bit of like psychology too, and so many ologies are in here. But it never feels forced. It doesn't feel like this story is just some sort of clumsy allegory whose only purpose is its message, and the whole rest of the story doesn't matter at all. Even the characters who don't appear for a very long time are so memorable and interesting, and I can remember a lot about them even now, a while after finishing the book. I'm giving it 4.5 stars. And the reason why I just gotta take off that little half star is because it did just take such a long time to get into this book, and it takes a really long time for Piranesi to put together the information that the readers can pretty easily, especially if you're a seasoned reader of fantasy and you sort of know how these multi-dimension things usually go. And so it did try my patience a little bit to have to sit with him while he does this, but honestly, it really was all worth it in the end, and I can wholeheartedly recommend Piranesi. Alright, looks like we've only got 1 book left. I wonder what it could be. Couldn't possibly be my very favorite book of 2020, could it? That's right, The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett. You know, in some ways, I don't know why I even did this, because I somehow knew that this book was just going to come out on top. If you haven't heard me just absolutely rave about this book before, The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett is the story of, also, it's another twin story, like Unsettled Ground. Identical twin sisters named Stella and Desiree grow up in an African-American community that's very fair-skinned and could usually pass as white for people who don't know them. The sisters decide to leave town, and one of them ends up marrying a very dark-skinned man, and the other one passes as white, doesn't tell the white guy she's dating that she's actually black, and marries him. And then the book that ensues is the story of these two women and also of their daughters. And I don't even know. I've talked about this book before. It's so brilliant. The writing has you right in there with the characters. Every character in this book is so well drawn. You feel like that they could be a real person that you might see on the street, and they feel almost more real to you than people that you know. We get a peep into all kinds of different people's perspective, not just the main characters, but the narrative doesn't judge them. It leaves it up to us to decide what kind of people they really are. It can be a little bit slow, especially at the beginning when it's establishing the world and the characters, but it's completely worth it by the end. Absolutely extraordinary. 5 stars, 5 stars, 5 stars. I also listened to an audiobook version of this one. It was read by Shayna Small, and it was genuinely one of the best audiobooks I've ever listened to. Shayna Small has this ability to mimic the voice of almost any accent from anywhere, almost any character from anywhere. California, the South, men, women, children, and they're all unique, and I don't understand how she does it, but I love it. Now for who I think would actually win. Okay, so, as much as I really want the Vanishing Half to win, I think there might be a chance that it won't, simply because it's so beloved, so universally just adored by everybody who reads it, and it's gotten so much positive press already. So I don't really know if that one's going to win. I think it absolutely could. The Women's Prize seems to have chosen like popular winners in the past. The Song of Achilles won, and everybody loves that book, so anything's possible. But I think if they decide to go maybe a more non-traditional route, it would be really cool if they picked Piranesi, because it's a fantasy book, and I think that fantasy books of that nature haven't won in the past. I mean, The Song of Achilles kind of was, but it was really more historical than anything else. Well, I guess the Trojan War isn't really historical, but it felt historical. Like, you know what I mean. You know what I mean, right? I honestly feel like Transcendent Kingdom is probably a pretty good contender. It wasn't my personal favorite, but I see the appeal for it, and I also think that it does do a good job of tying together a lot of different things, like immigrant experiences, drug overdose, depression, religion, and faith. Even though I wasn't as a huge fan of the execution, I can appreciate the work that went into it, and so I think that's a possibility too. But we all know I hope the Vanishing Half is going to win. Have you read any of the books on this shortlist? Do you now want to? Do you want to tell me about it? Please let me know in the comments. Meanwhile, I will be back some other time with a wrap-up of the other books that I read in June that weren't for the Women's Prize, and then some other stuff. I think I'm going to read another prize shortlist because this was actually really fun. See you soon. Bye.